bringing on a special guest, Will Flanders, Research Director of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, joins us on the phone line. Hey, Will.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Always appreciate your wisdom on this. One of the things that I've talked about a lot on this program over the last, 6 years now, next month, is education. And it's a hot-button topic. Folks in Wisconsin certainly attuned to that. While your organization, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, has produced a report looking at where we go, the differences between the choice schools, public schools, and maybe some lessons learned from those comparisons. So let's start with the basic stuff. The governor spoke about this. We certainly have the Republican response to that, as is normal after a State of the States. Your takeaways from that commentary on both sides and what it means for the conversation going forward.
Yeah, so I think the issue with the position that the governor has regularly taken, both as governor and even before that as DPI superintendent, is there seems to be a notion that simply throwing more money at public schools will solve all of the issues that we have. And while we're spending more than ever, especially when you include the federal funds that have come into schools since the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a ton of money going to schools over the last few years for that reason. We're not really seeing the results. In fact, we're seeing results decline across the board. So our argument is in general that we need more competition in the system and that our choice and charter sector can provide that. And the data in this report kind of suggests that they are indeed doing a better job in general with less funding overall.
Yeah, some of the numbers are pretty startling. Milwaukee's private choice schools, 8.1% higher in English language and arts, 8.3% higher in math on average than rates in the public schools. That's pretty significant.
That's right. I think it's important to know what we're trying to do here is not just look at the sort of raw numbers. What we do, what we call our apples to apples report here, is we try to adjust for those demographic factors that unfortunately do affect student performance across schools in Wisconsin and around the country. So we adjust for economic status. We adjust for student race. We know Wisconsin has some of the largest racial achievement gaps in the country, so unfortunately that matters. And after we do all those things and we sort of control for all those factors, these are the results that we come out with, which shows this big advantage for our choice schools, big advantage for our charter schools, both in Milwaukee and statewide.
One of the things I took away from your report is this. Per capita spending in a public school district has no statistical impact on student proficiency. Why is that?
Yeah, and this is something we've actually found every year we've done this report, and it's relatively consistent to what's found in research across the country, actually, that we're past what's known as the point of diminishing returns. Obviously, if we were spending no money on schools, if we were $0, we think there would be an impact. But we're spending more than $16,000 per student on average in Wisconsin. In a classroom of 20 kids, that's over $320,000 of value sitting in the classroom. And we're not really getting the bang for the buck for the investment that we're making. Again, we see proficiency declining, and we're past that point where more money can make a difference. What we need instead are more targeted solutions, and I think our choice and charter sectors in general might point the public schools in some directions to how they could help do more with less rather than simply asking for additional dollars, which are really flatlining results at best.
Will Flanders joining us on WTMJ, talking about education in Wisconsin. 2-year budget being formulated as we speak, at least the beginning process. Governor Evers, State Superintendent Jill Underly, calling for billions of dollars more invested in public school. As we've just talked about, that's not necessarily a wise investment. Did your study show, or did you go into this kind of detail, the money that's spent there, is it going in the right places? The funds were already moving to public schools. Are they going to the right places?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's very challenging to get into depth as to how exactly money is being spent because there's a lot of local discretion in terms of the tax money once it sort of leaves the state coffers. But what we do see is that there are districts that are on the low end of the spectrum that have super high performance, districts on the high end of the spectrum that have really low performance. And even putting aside our choice and charter sectors, there are lessons that can be learned for districts that do a lot with less money. I think a lot of it is unique to the individual district. We recognize that we're not advocating for a one size fits all in education. You have to deal with the students that are in your classroom, and what works in Milwaukee might not work in a rural part of the state. But what we do see is there are models that work, and we have the data in this analysis to point to those districts that do an effective job, and we think those should be the districts that others try to learn from, both both in the private and charter side, as we discussed, but also public school districts that are doing a more effective job and not spending as much money.
And the other big takeaway that I had reading the report is the fact that I would have assumed that some of the big city schools would be the worst performers, but in fact, your research shows that rural schools are the lowest performers.
Yeah, that's right. And it's important to note we're not just talking about Milwaukee when we talk about urban schools. We're using the sort of census definition of an urban area. So it includes, other cities like Appleton and places of that nature as well. But when we look at the four different classifications, urban, rural, suburban, and small town school districts, rural districts are actually the lowest proficiency districts in the state on average. So when folks in the legislature, when policymakers talk about the need to improve urban education, or that school choice is only something for Milwaukee, we think there's a good argument to be made that more options are needed across the state because we're failing our rural kids just as much as we're failing our urban kids. And I think that's a surprise to a lot of folks that think their rural districts are doing a pretty good job.
Will Flanders from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty joining us on WTMJ. The political reality in Wisconsin is we have a Democratic governor and a legislature controlled by Republicans. Given that reality, even with the supposed thaw that's happening in that relationship, do we expect any opportunity for expansion of choice charter and the funding questions? Where do we expect that to go?
Yeah, it's an important question, and I think it's certainly going to be a challenging environment. Our hope is that there might be potential for some sort of a grand bargain. Whether that's in the offer or not, I can't say. But there are areas where we might want to consider targeted additional spending in public schools, and some of those are areas that have been a priority for the governor in the past, like special needs funding, for example. But we think, given the growing evidence and the evidence that we've compiled over the years, as well as other groups, that the choice and charter sector provides effective competition. We think lifting those income limits so that more families have access to choice schools, so they're not the middle class isn't squeezed out of educational options, and then increasing the voucher amount so there's more parity with the traditional public schools are really important factors going forward, so that the choice and charter sector can continue to provide that important competition for our traditional public schools. While the governor's not been receptive to that in the past, we're optimistic that maybe we'll see something change here in the next budget.
I just thought of this, but we were talking about rural schools earlier being underperformers. Is it realistic to expect a rural school district to have the financial means to be able to create or support choice charter schools?
Yeah, so what's interesting in Wisconsin is that the rural schools aren't necessarily the low-funded schools in the state, and some of them that have vacation homes, up on Lake Superior and places like that, are actually some of the highest funded per pupil school districts in the state. There's pretty wide variation across the board, but we think competitive pressure should be even more important in those areas. There should be more of a drive to keep and retain students if there's a competition in a district where there's not a ton of replacement students available. But so it is a challenge. We don't deny that creates challenges for smaller town and rural school districts, but we think competition can be a good thing and drive improvement to ensure that those parents want to stay in their traditional public school rather than take advantage of the choice options that may become available.
I just thought of this. I mean, part of this dilemma in education in Wisconsin is the impact of school lockouts, remote learning. Did your reports touch on any of that?
Yeah, so we did a lot of work on the districts that stayed closed for a long time in the past couple of years. And in general, we found that those were the districts that fell the furthest behind. The ones that stayed shut down, like Milwaukee, like Madison, for the longest periods, are where we saw the biggest proficiency declines overall. What we see in this report, just looking at the overall numbers, is that we've not regained what we've lost. We had a little bit of a rebound in sort of math proficiency, but ELA proficiency, English Language Arts, actually continued on a downward trajectory to a small extent this year. So we've not gotten back to the proficiency rates we had pre-COVID. There's a lot of work to do there. And even then, pre-COVID, our proficiency rates were in the 40s, meaning that we were still failing more than 60% of our students in the state, even before the pandemic. Now we're down in the 30s in ELA and barely above 40% in math. So a lot of work to do, and the pandemic absolutely exacerbated it, especially those districts that stayed shut down even into the second school year that involved COVID.
Will Flanders, Research Director, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Always great stuff. Thanks for sharing your wisdom, Will.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Absolutely. Will Flanders joining me. Talking about education.